Hello friends, welcome to my channel. Let's go on. Many people don't understand the mechanism of sleep-of-tongue correction at the end of the previous chapter, so we need to analyze it further. However, before that, it's necessary to analyze an interesting example first. Almost all pregnant women have had a similar experience. That is, when they fart, the fetus in the abdomen will be startled and move. Why does the fetus react like this? Under normal circumstances, it's because the fetus lacks the cognition of the mother's farting. That is, there's no cognitive juice of the mother farting in its brain. But even if the fetus forms a certain cognition through several such experiences, it may still be startled when the sound of the fart comes next time. This example suggests an important inference. When the characteristic internal structure in the sensory input G wave lacks the activation of the corresponding cognitive or experiential G, this input G wave will activate the corresponding instinctive G, generating fear, surprise, excitement, or other physiological reactions. That is to say, even if there is a cognitive G of the mother's farting in the fetus's brain, but if this G is not in a sufficiently activated state, it will still be frightened. Conversely, the inference is that once the relevant cognitive or experiential G is activated to a certain extent, then the sensory input G wave will first be projected onto this relevant cognitive or experiential G, thus preventing the G wave from being projected onto the instinctive G group first, so that the physiological reaction is weakened or disappears. Of course, if the relevant cognitive or experiential G is also connected to the discomfort or pleasure sub-G, then the subsequent physiological reactions will be different. Therefore, we know that the activation of the relevant cognitive or experiential G provides a projection channel for the sensory input G wave containing specific characteristic internal structures, guiding the input G wave to the cognitive or experiential G and avoiding directly activating the corresponding instinctive G group. Referring to the fuzzy recognition we mentioned before, when comparing the characteristic internal structure of the sensory input G wave with that of the corresponding G, a few differences are allowed. That is, a certain degree of dispersion is permitted. Let's look back at the mechanisms of slip-of-tongue correction. Since correction occurs, the person who made the slip of the tongue must have recognized their mistake. That is, a G wave has activated the meaning G of the mistake. Then, what does this G wave look like? And how is it generated? Let's deduce it. If the leader in the previous chapter was deaf, then he couldn't hear what he read, so it would be difficult for him to recognize his mistake at the moment. Similarly, if the reader was absent-minded and just a simple reader who read the so-called slip of tongue from a miswritten speech without thinking much, then the character shape G input by the sensory G wave only activated a series of phonetic G. In this case, he also couldn't recognize his mistake at the moment. Thus, we know that for the mechanisms of slip of tongue correction, there must be both the current input of the sensory G wave and the activation of the original expected G. For the original expected G, after the behavioral G wave it activates, that is, the phonetic G wave is generated, it is converted into a auditory input G wave through voice and enters the brain. This auditory input G wave is projected onto the original expected G because it contains characteristic internal structures similar to the original expected G. The part of the slip of the tongue is the difference in this G wave. That is, this G wave has a relatively large degree of dispersion compared to the original expected G. We know that due to different intensities, times, and degrees of dispersion of the G wave, the activation degree of the corresponding G are different, and the subsequent generated G waves are also different. In detail, for the characteristic internal structure of the slip of tongue part, because there is no activation of the corresponding sub-G in the original expected G, this part of the G wave will be like the G wave of the fetus feeling the mother fighting. Without the reception of the activated sub-G, it will be continuously projected, and this part of the G wave will combine with the G wave after the current activation of the original expected G, thus forming a characteristic internal structure that can activate the cognitive G of the mistake. The cognitive G of the mistake has relatively stable G connection with the correction G or the current cognitive G of pros and cons due to the growth experiences. Eventually, it may lead to the activation of the corresponding G, and when the correction G takes effect, it is manifested as the reactivation of the original expected G with less interference. The above paragraph expounds on the mechanisms of cognitive error. That is, first, there must be a corresponding judgment criterion. So, as the original expected G in the slip of the tongue, and this judgment criterion should be in a certain activated state. Second, there must be a G wave projected onto this judgment criterion. The characteristic internal structure of this G wave can undergo fuzzy recognition with the judgment criterion, but there are different parts. Third, there must be a cognitive G of the mistake. Fourth, the G wave after the The activation of the judgment criterion combines with the characteristic internal structure of the different parts, generating a characteristic internal structure that can activate the cognitive G or the mistake. We can generalize this mechanism according to the size of the differences and various situations. We can deduce the mechanisms of resembling, very much resembling, having some differences, completely different, irrelevant, lovers with garages, diametrically opposed, harmonious, etc. These mechanisms are essentially the same. They are all about the G waves interacting with the G, and then the G waves combining in terms of characteristic internal structures, forming specific characteristic internal structures for the cognition of a certain thing, thus activating the corresponding cognitive G. Okay, that's all the content today. How do you feel? See you next time. Bye bye.